In the winter of 1873, a trading post at the edge of the Bitterroot Valley stood silent under 2 feet of snow. No fire had burned in its hearth for 11 years. The door hung on one hinge, sealed shut by ice at the threshold, and the spruce logs of its walls had taken on the gray-black coloring of old iron. The settlement nearest to it, a small freighting station called Keller's Ford, sat 4 miles south along the frozen river, and the men who rode past the trading post on their supply runs did not spare it more than a sidelong look. They called it the Birch Post after the dead man who had built it, and they agreed among themselves that it was worth exactly nothing. Nora Vass was 27 years old when she bid on it. She had $11.30 to her name, a canvas roll of her father's tools slung across her back, and no living relation she could call on in the territory. The family farm outside of Missoula had been sold at judgment 2 months prior. The land gone to a creditor with a Billings address and a sheaf of papers she had not been permitted to examine in full before the notary's seal had come down on them. She had stood in the yard of the farm for a quarter of an hour after the last of the papers were signed, looking at the house her father had built, and then she had gone inside and packed what she could carry into a hired buckboard and ridden north into the cold. She had passed through Keller's Ford once before, on a supply trip with her father the winter before last. It wasn't large. A freighting station, a livery, a half-dozen houses with chimneys smoking, and a general store that doubled as the post office. She had stayed 2 nights in a room above the freighting station, paying for her lodging with the $3 she had set aside from her traveling money, and had spent the evenings reading the notices posted on the station wall and listening to the freighters talk at the common table about road conditions north and east of the Ford. The auction notice had been posted on the station wall for 3 weeks, she was told. The auction was held in the yard of the freighting station on a Tuesday morning, the auctioneer standing on the running board of a wagon with a ledger tucked under one arm and his breath coming out in visible clouds. 14 men stood in the cold, listening, their boots planted in the hard-packed snow of the yard. The Birch Post was the last lot, called out after 2 mule teams, a hay press, and a collapsed grain shed had already gone. The auctioneer described it as a one-room structure in poor repair with one attached lean-to, approximately 25 miles of trapline claims staked along Birch Creek, and an inventory of goods long since frozen or spoiled. He said this last piece in a tone that invited laughter, and some man obliged him. Nora raised her hand at $2. No one else moved. The auctioneer looked at her steadily for a moment, the kind of steadiness a man deploys when he is not certain whether he has misunderstood something. Then he looked at the assembled men, then back at her. He knocked it down at $2.50, having added the additional $half himself from what she could only assume was a sense of ceremony, or mockery, or both. A man beside her in a canvas coat said, without lowering his voice, that she had bought herself a fine place to freeze to death. She took the deed certificate from the auctioneer's hand, folded it twice, and placed it in her coat pocket without reply. If you have ever inherited something heavier than its weight, something that carries a name and a history inside it alongside the thing itself, you may understand what it meant that the canvas roll on Nora Vass's back contained her father's trapping and assay tools. Jeremiah Vass had worked fur and mineral both, had spent 30 years walking claim lines and running trap lines across Montana, and had taught his daughter the habits of both trades before she was 15. He had begun the instruction when she was 9, taking her out on the eastern line before dawn in February to check the sets, and he had never softened the lessons for her on account of the cold, or her age, or the fact that no one expected a girl to need to know any of it. He had shown her how to read a bundle of cured fur for condition and grade, how to score a beaver pelt for the hide quality beneath, how to tell a marten from a fisher by the length and texture of the guard hairs, and how to weigh raw mineral samples with a balance scale adjusted for the altitude of whatever drainage they happened to be working. He had shown her how to test a pelt at the corner of the bundle before opening the whole of it to preserve the commercial grade of the rest. He had shown her the two-wrap cross-tie and the rawhide cord, the standard fastening of the independent upriver trappers, and told her what it meant about where a bundle had come from and who had packed it. He had died of a lung inflammation the previous spring, leaving her the tools and the knowledge to use them, and nothing else that the creditor had not been faster to claim. She rode north that same afternoon, the deed in her pocket and the tool roll on her back, with a rented horse she would need to return within the week. The birch post was worse than the auctioneer had described, which she had expected. The door, once she had worked the ice clear of the threshold with the heel of her boot, swung open to reveal a room held in the particular suspension of a place no one had entered in a long while. The cold inside was the same as the cold outside, which meant the walls still did their work even if the hearth had gone to ruin. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes move across the room slowly, the way her father had taught her to enter any new space, not looking for what she expected to find, but for what was actually there. The room was approximately 16 feet by 20. A plank counter ran along the east wall, its surface pale and dry under a layer of fine grit blown in through the gaps over the 11 years since Birch's last fire. The grain of the planks showed clearly through the grit, sound yellow pine under the dust, which told her the counter had been built well and from good lumber. Behind the counter, wooden shelving reached to the rafters, and on the shelves sat bundled goods still wrapped in oiled canvas, their ties gone brittle with cold and time. She lifted the edge of one wrapping and found a paper parcel beneath, its contents hard with cold, but its paper still intact, not rotted. The cold had been a preservative here as it had been everywhere in this country when it was cold enough and dry enough, and the Bitterroot winters met both conditions without difficulty. In the center of the room, two low storage benches sat on either side of a cold hearth, the hearthstones dark with old ash, and the firebox still holding the shape of the last fire that had burned in it. The unburned ends of two split logs resting against the backstone where they had been when the fire went out for the final time. She looked at them for a moment. Someone had loaded that hearth with the intention of coming back to it. Behind the hearth wall, through a narrow interior door, lay the lean-to the auctioneer had mentioned, barely 8 feet deep, with a plank floor that had warped from moisture and then frozen flat again. On the lean-to floor, stacked in orderly columns from floor to ceiling on 3 sides, were the furs. She stood in the lean-to entrance and counted the bundles by column. 44 bundles, each containing between 4 and 10 individual pelts, pressed flat and tied with rawhide cord. She lifted the nearest bundle from its column with both hands. It was heavier than a dry bundle of comparable size had any right to be. The furs were frozen solid. This was not by itself unusual. Frozen furs could still be graded once thawed, and if they had been properly cured before freezing, they might still carry their value. She set the bundle on the plank counter inside and studied it in the gray light coming through the single small window. The rawhide cord was tied in a style she recognized from her father's notes, a 2-wrap cross tie with a half-hitch finish, the pattern used by independent trappers working the upper Bitterroot drainage before the territorial buyer arrangements had consolidated the trade. This was old work, 11 years if the trading post had sat closed since Birch's death, and possibly older than that. She pulled the awl from her father's tool roll and worked it carefully through the wrapping at one corner to draw out a single pelt without breaking the bundle's seal. It was a beaver, prime winter grade, the under fur dense and even. She held it to the window light and ran her thumb along the guard hairs, reading the pile the way her father had taught her, feeling for the spring in the fiber that indicated good condition. The pelt was sound, not merely passable, sound. 11 years of deep frozen preservation had held the fiber better than any warehouse could have managed in a mild season, and the curing that had been done before freezing, she could tell from the texture of the hide side, had been careful and correct. She set the pelt down on the counter and stood with her hands flat on the wood and thought about what she had. The cold around her was absolute. The window held a single blue rectangle of winter sky. Somewhere outside, a raven called once and went silent. She spent the rest of that first afternoon making a count. She did not thaw the bundles, only probed each one at the corner with the awl to draw out a sample pelt for examination, recording her observations in the small notebook she carried in her breast pocket with a pencil she kept warm against her body. 44 bundles. Between 4 and 10 pelts per bundle. She estimated her count at somewhere between 300 and 350 individual pelts, the majority beaver, with a significant portion of marten, some ermine, a handful of otter, and 4 bundles in the southeast corner that she had not yet sampled. She built a fire in the hearth before the light went, using planks she pulled from the ruined lean-to floor, and ate the cold biscuits she had brought in her coat pocket, and she did not sleep well, though the room had grown warm enough by midnight that she could see her breath only faintly in the firelight. In the morning, she sampled the 4 remaining bundles in the corner. They were heavier than any of the others, considerably so, and when she worked the awl through the corner wrapping of the first, she found not a pelt but something else entirely. The bundle was wrapped in the same oiled canvas and tied with the same rawhide cord, but the interior was not fur. It was fur-wrapped. A layer of prime marten pelts formed the outer shell of the bundle, pressed flat and frozen around a cord that the awl struck with a sound that was not the soft resistance of cured hide, but a clear, brief ring of metal. She set the awl down and stood very still for a moment. Then she pulled her father's folding knife from the tool roll, worked the tip into the rawhide cord's half-hitch, and cut the tie. The bundle opened along the seam she had made. The outer marten pelts peeled back stiffly, still frozen at their centers, and inside them, packed in a second wrapping of oiled cloth, were coin sleeves. She could tell by the shape and the weight before she'd unwrapped the first one. Round cylinders, the standard paper and foil roll of a bank or an assay office, the kind used to package coin in counted lots. She brought the bundle to the counter, unwrapped the cloth carefully, and laid out what she found. 30 coin rolls. She counted them twice. She unwrapped one at the end and tipped its contents into her palm. $20 gold pieces, crisp struck, the dates ranging from 1857 through 1861. She counted 20 coins in the roll. She wrapped them again, returned them to the sleeve, and sat down on the storage bench beside the cold hearth with her hands in her lap. The other 3 corner bundles, when she opened them with the same care, held 30 rolls each. 4 bundles, 30 rolls per bundle, 20 gold coins per roll. 2,400 gold coins, each a double eagle worth $20. She did not calculate the total aloud. She calculated it in her head 3 times, checking each pass against the others, and then she sat in the cold room of the birch post with the fire burning low and the winter light moving across the plank floor, and she held herself very still inside the fact of it. $48,000 in gold coin, hidden inside the fur bundles of a dead man's trading post, which she had bought for $2.50. The question, once the shock of the count had settled into something she could carry, was not what the money was worth. The question was where it had come from and who it had belonged to before Isaac Birch had packed it into his lean-to and died. There are facts that announce themselves and facts that have to be dug for. And she was her father's daughter in this, as in most things. She did not assume the coin was Birch's to leave, and she did not pocket it and ride south. She wrapped the corner bundles back in their oiled cloth and restacked them in the column where she had found them. And then she went to work on the plank counter. The counter had 2 shelves beneath it, enclosed by fitted wooden doors on iron hinges. Both were frozen shut. She worked them open with the pry bar from the tool roll, a short-handled iron bar her father had used for levering trap stakes, and inside the lower shelf she found what a man who kept accounts would keep: a ledger. It was wrapped in oilskin and tied shut with a separate cord, and its pages, when she carefully worked them apart at the corner, were stiff but legible. Isaac Birch had kept his accounts in a small, precise hand, the entries dated and described with the specificity of a man who expected to be audited. She read the ledger at the counter with the ledger propped against a tin that she balanced on the counter's edge, turning the frozen pages slowly so they did not crack. The trapline entries ran from the spring of 1857 through the autumn of 1862. They were straightforward in their entries, noting dates, catch counts by species, weights, and the name of the buyer. The buyer, in every entry from 1857 through the spring of 1861, was a firm called Crandall and Associates, a territorial fur-buying operation she had not heard of. The prices recorded were low, markedly lower than the market rates she knew from her father's records for comparable periods, but she set that aside for later reading. Beginning in the summer of 1861, the entries changed. The catch counts continued, but the buyer column was left blank for 6 months. Then, in the winter of 1861, a series of entries appeared under a new heading that read, in Birch's small hand, "Receipts held in trust." The amounts corresponded to the coin rolls she had found, recorded individually in the ledger by roll number and date of deposit, with a notation beside each that read, "Provenance, disputed, C&A account, see correspondence." She closed the ledger and looked at the lean-to. The correspondence took most of that morning to find. It was in the second place she looked, which was inside the tin she had used to prop the ledger, a round tobacco tin that contained not tobacco, but a set of folded letters, 12 of them, bound with a ribbon that had once been green and was now brown. She read them at the counter in order of date. The story they told was precise and damaging. Crandall and Associates had operated in the upper Bitterroot drainage for 7 years as a buyer and broker of territorial furs, contracting with independent trappers on a rate schedule they set unilaterally and revised downward every 2 years. The contracts were written in the careful language of a firm that employed lawyers, and the trappers who signed them did so in the station yards and supply posts where a Crandall agent came once a season. Often on the same day, a man was trying to outfit for the next run and needed credit extended. The trappers signed without access to the market rates that Crandall's own agents published separately in the Missoula and Helena papers, rates that ran between 20 and 40% higher than the contracted prices. The difference, accumulated over 7 years, across 11 independent trappers who had sold through Crandall, had been absorbed into the firm's operating accounts and recorded in their filings with the Territorial Trade Office as a margin adjustment for handling and transport. It was a clean theft, the kind that leaves no blood and requires only paperwork and the calculated assumption that the men on the other side of the contracts would never be in a room with the men who could show them the published rates. Isaac Birch had discovered this in the summer of 1861, when a cousin of his, a freighting agent working the Helena Road, had shown him a market rate sheet from the Helena paper that contradicted a Crandall statement he was holding. Birch had gone quiet when he saw the numbers, she imagined, the way a man goes quiet when he understands that something he accepted as ordinary is not ordinary at all. He had spent the next 6 months comparing his own records against the published sheets, working through every transaction across 7 years of Crandall sales, and had arrived at a precise figure: $1,140 owed to him personally, across 7 years of undervalued transactions. He had then, with considerably more patience than most men would have found, written to the other 10 independent trappers, whose names he knew from the Crandall account lists, and asked them each to send him copies of their statements. 8 had responded. Their combined shortfalls, calculated against the published market rates for their respective transaction years, came to just over $14,000. The coin in the lean-to was the escrow of Birch's resolution of the matter. He had refused in the autumn of 1862 to sell his catch to Crandall at the stated rate, and had demanded full market price in cash, which Crandall had declined to pay. The winter of 1862 had involved a set of exchanges she could only partially reconstruct from the letters, with negotiations moving through intermediaries she could not entirely identify. 2 of the letters were from a Missoula lawyer named Carver, who had helped Birch draft a formal demand addressed to the Crandall managing office. 3 came from the Crandall office itself, formal and cold, written in the same careful language as the original contracts, denying all claims and citing the signed agreements as full and final settlement of any outstanding obligations. The 12th letter, dated March of 1863, was from Birch himself. He had written it to Carver in a hand less steady than the ledger entries, explaining that Crandall had ultimately sent a representative to Keller's Ford with a settlement payment of $48,000 in gold coin. Birch had noted in the letter that he believed the figure represented the aggregate shortfall for all 11 trappers combined rather than merely his own, and that he intended to divide it according to the documented underpayments once he had finished verifying each man's amounts. He had noted also that he was not feeling well and that the verification was taking longer than he had expected. He had died that April. Lung fever, the same as her father 11 years apart, and the same outcome either way. She stood at the counter for a long time with the letters in her hands. She thought about what her father had said once about the habit of a thing that has been made right, compared to a thing that has been left wrong. He'd been talking about a trap spring he had repaired, pressing the leaf back into tension with patient pressure rather than hammering it. And he had said that a repaired spring held its set better than a new one, because you understood what had broken it. She had thought at the time that he was talking about traps. She understood now that he had been talking about most things. If you have ever stood in a cold room with the weight of someone else's debt in your hands, you understand that the question is never whether to carry it. The question is how. She began the work of confirmation the following morning, when the fire had warmed the room enough that the paper of the ledger was flexible, and the ink of Birch's entries could be read without the stiffness that cold brought to old documents. She went through the ledger again, page by page, extracting every name from the trapper entries across the 7 years of Crandall contracts. 11 names in all, with their catch dates and the amounts Crandall had paid them as recorded in Birch's duplicate copies of their individual statements. Then she went to Keller's Ford. The freighting station had a postmaster who doubled as a recorder for the surrounding district, an elderly man named Haas, who kept his records in a locked room off the main building, and who regarded Nora's arrival with the particular wariness of a man accustomed to being asked to locate things that were inconvenient to locate. She told him what she was looking for: trapping license records for the upper Bitterroot drainage from 1855 through 1863, and any Crandall and Associates account filings that had been submitted to the Territorial Trade Office. He told her those records were archived and not for general circulation. She told him she was seeking to verify the identities of potential heirs to a disputed estate, which was true enough, and that she would need only to compare names and dates, not to remove any document from the premises. He considered this for a longer time than was strictly necessary, and then he unlocked the records room. She worked in the records room for 2 full days, sitting at the single table with the stove burning beside her and the lamp trimmed high, cross-checking Birch's ledger against the licensing records and the Crandall filings that Haas had located in the archives. The records were not organized for the kind of search she was conducting, and she spent the first morning simply learning the filing system well enough to navigate it, pulling the relevant years by territory subdivision, and working backward through the renewal records until each name in Birch's ledger had either a current address or a status notation, or nothing at all. Of the 11 trappers named in Birch's records, 4 were still living in the territory and could be located through current addresses recorded in the licensing renewals. 3 were listed as deceased in the renewal records, with notation of surviving family in 2 of the 3 cases. 4 could not be traced at all from the filings she had access to. That left 7 traceable parties, and she wrote each name and their verified shortfall figure in a column in her notebook with the same care she gave to an assay record, each number checked twice before she committed it to the page. $48,000, less Birch's own documented shortfall of $1,140, which she treated separately from the beginning because it would need its own accounting regardless of what else was decided. She worked out the distribution proportionally, each party's share weighted against their documented underpayment as a fraction of the total shortfall Birch had verified. The arithmetic was not complicated, only tedious, and she ran it twice to confirm. When the column was balanced to her satisfaction, she copied it onto a clean page of the notebook and sat for a moment looking at it, the names and the numbers in the stillness of the records room with the stove ticking beside her. On the 3rd day, she began writing letters. She wrote 4, 1 to each of the living trappers whose addresses she had found in the licensing renewals, identifying herself as the purchaser of the Birch Post and, in practical terms, the executor of Isaac Birch's uncompleted distribution. She chose her words carefully. She explained that she had recovered documentation indicating a disputed payment from Crandall and Associates had been held in escrow by Isaac Birch at the time of his death, and that she was writing to invite each man to correspond with her or to come to the Birch Post to examine the records themselves. She gave the amounts she had calculated for each man's share, written plainly in the body of each letter without hedging, so that there was no ambiguity about what she was telling them. She did not exaggerate the amounts and did not minimize them. The letter to Haas she wrote last, explaining the situation in full and asking him to advise whether there was a legal mechanism in the territory for locating heirs to deceased trappers in cases of disputed estate distribution. He had softened considerably over the 2 days she had worked in his records room, and he told her when she brought him the stack of letters to post that he would write to the Territorial Trade Office himself on the matter, and that he expected no particular difficulty from it. He said she had done the documentation correctly, which she took as the highest form of praise he had available, and did not press him further. She rode back to the Birch Post in the late afternoon, the cold pressing down from the mountain ridges as the sun dropped behind the western peaks, the river ice on Birch Creek showing the pale gray blue of deep cold in the fading light. The first trapper to come was a man named Dunbar, who arrived by horse 2 weeks after she had posted the letters, alone and with his hat in his hands as he ducked through the door of the trading post. He was in his late 50s, his face weathered to leather by 4 decades on the trap lines, the kind of weathering that does not come from weather alone, but from years of working alone in cold country and having no one to answer to for it. He stood at the counter and looked at her with the careful stillness of a man who has been disappointed often enough to protect himself against the preliminary shape of hope. She laid the ledger open on the counter, then the Crandall statement duplicate that Birch had kept for Dunbar's transactions, then the notebook page with her calculation. She did not narrate any of it. She stood back and let him read, He read slowly. He ran one finger along the column of Birch's entries and then along her own column, checking the arithmetic the way a man checks arithmetic he wants to trust but needs to verify himself. When he was finished, he looked up. She set his coin rolls on the counter in front of him, the quantity she had verified against his documented shortfall, which came to $860. He stood looking at them for a long moment. The fire in the hearth made a small sound, and outside the wind moved through the spruce on the ridge. He said, his voice flat and controlled, that he had stopped running the upper drainage after the Crandall arrangement went bad, and had spent the decades since working as a freighter's hand, hauling goods on the Keller's Ford to Hamilton Road, because he had not had the money to outfit a new trapping season after what Crandall had taken from the previous ones. She told him she was sorry for that. He picked up the coin rolls and held them in both hands, not unwrapping any of them, only weighing the aggregate of them, and then he set them carefully in his coat pocket. He thanked her in a voice that had no room left in it for any more words than those. He put his hat back on and went out through the door, and she heard his horse move away north along the drainage, the sound of the hooves on the frozen creek bank diminishing until there was only the fire and the wind. The second letter to be answered came not from the trapper it had been addressed to, but from his daughter, a woman named Clara Dole, living outside of Hamilton, who wrote to say that her father had died the previous year, and that she was his only heir, and that she had not known anything of a Crandall dispute. Nora wrote back with the documentation and invited her to correspond with Haas about the legal verification, and Clara Dole came herself 3 weeks later, driving a wagon through freshly fallen snow, and sat across the counter from Nora with the letters and the ledger pages laid out between them. Clara was about Nora's age. She read the documents with the careful attention of a woman who had been responsible for her own affairs for some time. When she finished, she folded the pages back in the order she had received them and sat quietly for a moment. She said that the family had sold the homestead the year her father died, that the debts against it had been more than the land had covered, and that she and her children were living with her husband's brother. Nora counted out the coin rolls for Clara's father's verified share, $920, and slid them across the counter. Clara Dole looked at them. Then she looked at Nora. She asked how Nora had come to be the one to find all this. Nora told her about the auction and the $2.50 bid, and her father's tools, and what the awl had struck when she had pressed it through the corner of the bundle. She told it plainly, without ornament, and Clara listened with the full attention of someone who recognized a thing that had required skill to find. When Nora finished, Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she supposed there were worse ways a thing could be discovered. Nora said she supposed the same. The remaining distributions came in across the late winter and into the spring. The 2 other living trappers who responded, the correspondence through Haas about the heirs of the deceased, a process that took the better part of 4 months through a trade office inquiry and ultimately connected 2 of the 3 deceased trappers to surviving family. The 4th traceable figure, a trapper whose licensing record showed an address in the Flathead country, never responded to the letter she posted, and the share she had calculated for him she held in a separate envelope with his name on it, on the same shelf in the lean-to where the bundles had stood. The sum she could not distribute because she could not locate the party was $240. She left it where it was. Birch's own share was a different matter. He had no documented heir, no family recorded in any of the filings she had found, and the $1,140 that represented his portion of the Crandall shortfall had been sitting in the lean-to for 11 years. She wrote to the trade office herself on this question, and the response that came back 3 months later, routed through Haas, confirmed that with no identified heir and no will on file, goods held in escrow at the time of death, and with no claimant registered within a statutory period, became the property of the purchaser of the estate. She read that letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the oilskin with the other correspondence. She used Birch's share to repair the trading post. She hired a Keller's Ford carpenter named Pell to replace the lean-to floor and reframe the door and repoint the chimney, and she paid him in coin at the going rate and watched the work without hovering, as her father had taught her. Pell was a careful worker, not fast, and he asked good questions before he cut anything, which she appreciated. He replaced the floor joists in the lean-to where they had gone soft with old moisture, sistering new timber alongside the original beams where they were still sound, and the floor he laid over them was level and tight, with no give under the foot. She relaid the plank counter herself, cutting the warped boards to true on a sawbuck she set up in the yard when the spring weather came warm enough to work outdoors, and fitting the replacement planks with the hand plane from her father's tool roll, working the surface until it was flat and smooth and would not move under the pressure of a ledger or a balance scale placed on it. She rehung the shelving in the east wall, using the original lag points in the log where the wood was still sound, and drilling new ones where the old had worked loose. Pell came back for a day to help her lift the upper shelves into their brackets, and she paid him for the day and fed him the noon meal besides, which was the custom. By late spring, the Birch post was a working structure again. She did not traffic in fur buying. The Crandall arrangement and what it had produced had made her careful about the particular commerce of unverifiable grades and contracted rates, and in any case, the independent trapping networks of the upper Bitterroot drainage had thinned considerably in the decade following Birch's death, the consolidation that Crandall had pursued having accomplished what it intended to accomplish, even if its method had eventually come to light. What remained of the local fur trade she referred to the Keller's Ford station and took a modest referral fee for the connection, which Haas had proposed and which the station owner had agreed to readily enough. It was a fair arrangement and required nothing of her beyond making the introductions. She dealt in assay work instead. Her father's tools included a portable balance scale, a set of mineral test acids in their wooden case, and a small furnace collar that could be rigged to any functional hearth and run at sufficient temperature for basic metallurgical assessment. The miners working the placer deposits along Birch Creek and the side drainages it fed from had no closer assay service than Hamilton, which was a day's ride in good conditions and longer in poor. She posted a notice at Keller's Ford and at 2 of the mine camp supply points east of the drainage, and the first work began to come before the snow was entirely off the higher ridges. By midsummer, Dunbar came back. He brought a sample from a placer claim he had taken up on a side creek east of the main drainage, and set it on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned to manage his own expectations. She tested it at the hearth while he waited on the storage bench with a cup of the coffee she kept on the stove, and when the balance gave her the read, she recorded it in her ledger and called out the figure. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had not found a color like that in 15 years on the creek. She wrote out his assay certificate in her own hand, the same small, precise script she had learned from her father, signed it at the bottom and slid it across the counter. He held it in both hands, reading it once, then looked up at her and said that it appeared she had an eye for what was in a thing. She said she had been taught to look carefully. He nodded once and folded the certificate into his coat pocket and picked up his sample pouch and went out. The summer light came through the single window at a low angle in the late afternoon and lay across the counter in a long, pale rectangle, and the dust that had settled in the years the post had stood empty was gone now, scoured out in the spring cleaning, and the wood of the counter was clean and worn smooth under her hands. Her father's balance scale sat on the shelf behind her, its brass pans level in the still air, the beam perfectly centered. She reached out and touched the near pan with one finger, the way her father had always touched it before beginning a new assay. A gesture not of checking but of greeting, the acknowledgement of a tool that had worked faithfully for the better part of 30 years and could be expected to work faithfully still. Outside, the creek ran loud with snowmelt through a channel it had cleared for itself in the spring ice, and the spruce forest on the ridge above the post was the deep green of the short mountain summer, and the sky above it was the particular blue that does not last long at that altitude before the afternoon clouds begin to build. A raven called somewhere up the drainage, distant and unconcerned, and the sound of it carried down through the open door without urgency. There are things the world considers worthless that are only waiting for someone to know what to look for. Isaac Birch had known, and the knowledge had outlasted him, sealed in the cold for 11 years, until a woman with the right tools and the patience to use them had come through the door and found it. What she had done with the finding was not complicated. It was simply the thing that needed doing, done carefully and in order, the way her father had taught her to do any work that was worth the doing at all. She closed the assay ledger and set the pencil in the groove along the cover's edge and listened to the creek and the raven and the wind in the spruce, and the birch post stood around her, solid and repaired and quietly present, as though it had only ever been waiting for someone to open it.